I was staring at my frozen driveway at 6 in the morning when I realized someone had stolen my heated hose, and that's when everything went to hell. My name is Patrick Peterson, and I'd been living in the Meadowbrook Heights subdivision in Rochester, Minnesota, for 3 years. The place was nice enough, typical American suburb with cookie-cutter houses and manicured lawns, but the HOA made life miserable. Our neighborhood had one of those associations that actually enforced every tiny rule in the book, led by a woman named Patricia Kendrick, who embodied every stereotype of a middle-aged HOA president you could imagine. Blonde highlights, always wore athletic wear despite never exercising, and had a smile that never reached her eyes. But back to that morning. It was January 15th, and Minnesota was experiencing one of those deep freezes that made the news. -20 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind chill making it feel like -40. The kind of cold that hurt your face within seconds of stepping outside. I'd specifically purchased a heated hose system 3 months earlier because I knew winter would be brutal, and I needed to keep water flowing to my workshop in the backyard where I ran my small woodworking business. The hose wasn't just any hose. It was a commercial-grade heated hose, nearly 200 feet long, that I'd had specially installed by a licensed plumber. It connected from a dedicated water source to my workshop, keeping the water from freezing even in extreme temperatures. The thing had cost me almost $3,000 between the hose itself and the installation, and now it was gone. I stood there in my thick winter coat, my breath forming clouds in the frigid air, staring at the empty space where the hose should have been coiled. The connection point was still there, the special fitting the plumber had installed, but the entire length of heated hose had vanished. My first thought was theft. Maybe someone had broken into my yard during the night and stolen it. But as I walked around the side of my house, I noticed something odd. The gate to my backyard was open, and there were footprints in the snow. Small footprints, like from women's boots, and they led not away from my property but toward the front of the subdivision. I followed the footprints, my anger growing with each step. The trail led down my driveway, across the street, and right up to Patricia Kendrick's house. But the footprints didn't stop there. They continued past her house, around the corner, and ended at the community center building where the HOA held their meetings. The community center was a modest single-story building that the HOA used for meetings and events. It had a small office where Patricia spent most of her time, probably dreaming up new rules to torment residents with. I tried the door and found it locked, which was unusual for this early on a weekday morning. Usually, the building was open by 6 for the few residents who used the small gym inside. I pulled out my phone and called Patricia's number. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice chipper and fake sweet. "Good morning, Patrick. What can I do for you? Someone stole my heated hose last night." "The footprints lead to the community center. Do you know anything about that?" There was a pause. "Oh, that hose. Yes, I had it removed." I felt my blood pressure spike. "You what?" "I had it removed. It was in violation of HOA rules." Section 12. Subsection 4 of the Covenants clearly states that no external hoses are permitted to remain connected during winter months. They're unsightly. "Patricia, that's a heated hose. It's supposed to stay connected. I need it for my workshop. And you can't just steal people's property." "I didn't steal anything," she said, her voice taking on that condescending tone she used when she thought she was right. "I confiscated HOA violating items, which is within my rights as president. You can pick it up from the community center after you've paid the fine and signed an agreement to not reinstall it." "What fine?" $500 for the violation, plus a $100 storage fee. I was so angry I could barely speak. That's insane. I'm coming to get my hose right now. The community center doesn't open until 9, she said. And I'm not there right now. I'll see you at 9 if you'd like to discuss this further. She hung up. I stood there in the freezing cold, shaking with rage. This wasn't just about the hose anymore. This was about Patricia overstepping her authority in a major way. You can't just take someone's property, regardless of HOA rules. That's theft, plain and simple. I went back home and called my lawyer, a guy named Tom Richards who'd helped me with my business incorporation. He listened to my story and let out a low whistle. Patrick, that's absolutely theft. HOA or not, she can't just take your property. Did she give you written notice about the violation first? No, nothing. I just woke up and it was gone. Then she violated the HOA's own procedures. Even if there was a violation, which I doubt since heated hoses are specifically meant to stay connected, she has to give written notice and a chance to remedy before taking any action. I'll draft a letter demanding immediate return of your property. Can we do more than that? Can we get the police involved? Absolutely. This is theft. Call the non-emergency line and file a report. I did exactly that. The dispatcher seemed sympathetic and said she'd send an officer to take a report. While I waited, I did something else. I called the fire department. Here's the thing about my heated hose that Patricia didn't know. The plumber who installed it had connected it to a very specific water source. My property was on the corner of Maple Street and Oak Avenue, right next to one of the neighborhood's fire hydrants. The city had a program that allowed property owners to connect to the hydrant system for a fee, as long as the installation met certain requirements and included proper backflow prevention. I'd gone through all the proper channels, paid the fees, and had everything inspected and approved. My heated hose was connected to the fire hydrant system. When I explained this to the fire department dispatcher, there was a long silence. Then she asked me to repeat everything. Then she said she was sending someone immediately. The police arrived first. Officer Bradley Moore was a tired-looking guy in his 40s who seemed annoyed to be out in the cold. But when I explained what happened and showed him the documentation for my heated hose system, his demeanor changed. She took a hose connected to the fire hydrant. Where did she take it? The community center. She said she confiscated it for HOA violations. He shook his head. That's not how any of this works. Let's go talk to her. The fire department arrived as we were about to leave. 2 firefighters in a red truck, looking concerned. The older one, whose name tag read Morrison, examined the connection point where my hose had been. This is a proper installation. Did you disconnect it, or did someone else? The HOA president disconnected it and took it. She didn't know what it was connected to. Morrison's expression darkened. Do you know if she reconnected the system properly after removing the hose? I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. I have no idea. Show me where she took it. We formed a strange convoy, me in my truck, Officer Moore in his patrol car and the fire truck behind us, driving the 2 blocks to the community center. Patricia's silver Lexus was now in the parking lot, which meant she'd arrived. The community center door was propped open. We all went inside. The building was warmer than outside but still chilly. Patricia was in the office, sitting at the desk with her laptop open. She looked up as we entered, and her expression went from confident to confused to alarmed in about 3 seconds. Officer, what's going on? Madam, I'm Officer Moore with Rochester PD. I understand you removed property from Mr. Peterson's residence last night without his permission. It wasn't theft. It was an HOA violation and I confiscated it according to our rules. Madam, you can't confiscate someone's personal property. That's theft. Where is the hose now? Patricia stood up, crossing her arms defensively. It's in the storage room in the back, but this is an HOA matter, not a police matter. Morrison stepped forward. It became a city matter when you disconnected equipment from the fire hydrant system. Show me where the hose is now. The color drained from Patricia's face. Fire hydrant. It's just a garden hose. It's a heated hose connected to the municipal fire suppression system. If you didn't properly secure the connection after removing it, you've compromised fire safety for this entire neighborhood. Show me. Now. We followed Patricia to the storage room. She unlocked it with shaking hands, and there was my hose, coiled messily in the corner. Morrison examined it closely, then pulled out his phone and made a call. We need someone to check the hydrant connection at Maple and Oak immediately. Possible compromise to the system. He hung up and turned to Patricia. Did you close the valve when you disconnected this? I don't know what valve you're talking about. I just unscrewed it from the connector thing. Morrison closed his eyes briefly like he was praying for patience. You just unscrewed it while water was flowing through it. There wasn't any water flowing. It was winter. It's a heated system. The water flows continuously to prevent freezing. Where did you disconnect it? Patricia's face had gone from pale to green. At his house, at the connector on the side of the building. Morrison immediately went outside and made another call. I heard him say something about potential water main breach and immediate response needed. Officer Moore was taking notes. Miss Kendrick, I need to understand the timeline. When exactly did you remove this hose? Last night. Around 8. And did water spray out when you disconnected it? Patricia's silence was answer enough. Miss Kendrick, answer the question. Yes, a lot of water came out. I got soaked, but I managed to get the cap from my garage and screwed it onto the connection to stop it. Officer Moore and I exchanged glances. I spoke up. What cap? Just a cap. A hose cap. It fit perfectly. Morrison came back inside and his expression was grim. We've got a crew heading to check the hydrant now. Madam, do you understand what you've done? You disconnected a pressurized line from the fire suppression system and capped it with an unapproved fitting. If that cap fails, we've got a water main break. If there's a fire and we try to use that hydrant, we could have a massive pressure problem. Patricia sat down heavily in one of the folding chairs in the storage room. I didn't know. How was I supposed to know? By not touching other people's property, Officer Moore said. Miss Kendrick, I'm going to need you to stay here while we sort this out. You're being detained for investigation of theft and tampering with fire safety equipment. The next hour was chaotic. More firefighters arrived. City workers came to inspect the hydrant connection. I retrieved my hose, though Morrison told me not to reconnect it until the city crew had inspected and fixed whatever Patricia had done to the connection point. It turned out that the generic hose cap Patricia had used was not rated for the pressure of the hydrant system. It was holding barely, but the city water department supervisor who arrived on scene called it a disaster waiting to happen. If there had been a fire and they'd tried to use that hydrant, the cap would have blown off and caused a massive water spray that would have dropped pressure throughout the neighborhood. Patricia was arrested. Officer Moore charged her with theft of property and criminal mischief. The fire marshal, who arrived later that morning, added charges of tampering with fire safety equipment. She was handcuffed and put in the back of the patrol car, crying and insisting she'd just been trying to enforce the rules. But it got worse for Patricia. Much worse. When the city crew fully inspected the connection, they found that Patricia hadn't just unscrewed the hose. In her struggle to disconnect it while water was spraying everywhere, she damaged the backflow preventer, a critical safety device that prevented contaminated water from flowing back into the city water supply. The damage was significant enough that the entire assembly had to be replaced, at a cost of over $15,000. The city immediately issued a citation to Patricia for damaging city property. They also sent a notice to every resident of Meadowbrook Heights that the water at the Maple and Oak intersection had to be shut off for emergency repairs, meaning 20 houses would be without water for at least 8 hours. My phone started ringing off the hook. Neighbors who'd never spoken to me suddenly wanted to know what was going on. Word spread fast that Patricia had caused the problem, and the mood in the neighborhood turned ugly. I spent the rest of the morning dealing with the city workers, giving statements and coordinating the repair of my hose connection. Tom, my lawyer, arrived around noon with a huge smile on his face. "Patrick, this is better than I could have hoped. She's not just looking at criminal charges. The HOA's insurance is going to have a field day with this, and you've got grounds for a massive civil suit. I just want my hose back and to be left alone. You'll get more than that. She caused damage to city property while illegally confiscating your property. The HOA is liable, and as president, she's personally liable. We're talking serious money." I wasn't really interested in the money, but I was interested in making sure Patricia couldn't do this to anyone else. Tom filed an emergency restraining order that afternoon, prohibiting Patricia from taking any enforcement action on behalf of the HOA pending a hearing. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later, but things continued to escalate before then. 2 days after the incident, I received a notice in the mail from the HOA. It was signed by Patricia and informed me that I was being fined $500 for the water shutoff that had inconvenienced the neighborhood. I literally laughed out loud. The woman had been arrested for stealing my property and was trying to fine me for the consequences of her own actions. Tom filed that as evidence in both the criminal and civil cases. He also reached out to the other HOA board members. There were 5 of them, including Patricia, and none of them had known about her late-night hose confiscation. When they learned what had happened, 3 of them immediately resigned from the board. The other one, a guy named Stuart Williams who lived down the street from me, called an emergency HOA meeting to remove Patricia from the presidency. I attended that meeting. It was held in the same community center where my hose had been stored, and the room was packed. Easily 100 residents showed up, which was probably the highest attendance in the HOA's history. Everyone wanted to see Patricia held accountable. Stuart ran the meeting. He was a nervous guy in his 60s, clearly uncomfortable being in charge, but he did his best. He read out a motion to immediately remove Patricia as president and to ban her from holding any HOA position in the future. Patricia stood up to defend herself. She'd made bail and was wearing a business suit like she was going to court, her blonde hair perfectly styled. She looked around the room with that fake smile. "I understand that there have been some misunderstandings about my actions. I was simply trying to enforce our community rules. Mr. Peterson had an unsightly hose that violated our aesthetic standards. I removed it, following procedures that I believed were correct. I had no way of knowing about the fire hydrant connection. That should have been disclosed to the HOA. I raised my hand. Stuart recognized me. I did disclose it. I submitted the plans to the HOA before installation, along with the city permits. Patricia approved them herself. She signed the approval form. Tom handed me a folder. I pulled out the document and held it up. It was the HOA approval form, dated from the previous October, with Patricia's signature clearly visible at the bottom. The room erupted. Residents who'd been on the fence about Patricia started shouting questions at her. How could she approve something and then confiscate it? Why didn't she remember approving it? Was she lying then or lying now? Patricia's face flushed red. I sign dozens of forms every month. I can't be expected to remember every single one. And regardless of what I approved, that doesn't change the fact that the hose was unsightly. An older woman in the back stood up. I recognized her as Margaret Chen, who lived 2 houses down from me. Patricia, you've been fining people for nonsense for years. My grandson's car got towed because you said it was parked illegally, even though it was in my own driveway. You fined the Johnsons $300 because their mailbox was the wrong shade of black. You sent a violation notice to the Rodriguezes because their Christmas lights were up 2 days past New Year's. Everyone here is sick of it. The room exploded with people sharing their own Patricia stories. She'd been terrorizing the neighborhood for her entire tenure as president, enforcing rules that didn't exist and making up fines. People pulled out their phones and showed violation notices, fines, and threatening letters. It was like a dam had broken. Stewart let people vent for about 10 minutes, then called for order. We need to vote on the motion. All in favor of removing Patricia Kendrick as HOA president and banning her from future board service. Every single hand went up except Patricia's. She looked around the room in shock, like she couldn't believe what was happening. The motion passes unanimously, Stewart said. Patricia, you're removed as president effective immediately. Please surrender any HOA property you have, including keys, files, and the HOA bank card. Patricia stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. You can't do this to me. I've dedicated years to this community. I've kept this neighborhood beautiful and maintained our property values. You're making a huge mistake. The mistake was letting you run things for so long, someone called out. Patricia grabbed her purse and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. Stewart looked exhausted. Okay, we need to elect a new president and figure out how to handle the mess she's left behind. But first, I want to apologize to Mr. Peterson and anyone else who was treated unfairly by Patricia's interpretation of our rules. This HOA is supposed to maintain our community, not make residents' lives miserable. The meeting continued for another hour. They elected Stewart as interim president, formed a committee to review all of Patricia's violation notices and fines from the past year, and voted to update the HOA bylaws to prevent future abuse of power. Several people apologized to me personally for not speaking up sooner about Patricia's behavior. I left feeling better than I had in days, but I knew the situation wasn't over. The criminal charges were still pending, and Tom was preparing the civil lawsuit. The city finished repairing the hydrant connection 3 days after Patricia's arrest. They sent me a bill for $200 for reconnecting my hose, which was way less than I'd expected. The new backflow preventer was much more robust than the old one, essentially a free upgrade. My workshop was back in business. I spent the next week catching up on orders, the heated hose working perfectly, keeping water flowing despite the continued cold snap. The criminal case moved faster than I expected. Patricia's lawyer tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the prosecutor wasn't having it. This was a high-profile case in Rochester, the kind of thing that made the local news. HOA president arrested for tampering with fire safety equipment was a headline that got attention. The preliminary hearing was held in late February. I had to testify about what happened. Patricia's lawyer, a sharp-looking woman named Jennifer Dalton, tried to paint her client as a well-meaning volunteer who made an innocent mistake. Miss Kendrick had no way of knowing that the hose was connected to the fire hydrant system, Dalton argued. She saw what appeared to be a violation of HOA rules and took action. At worst, this is a civil matter, not criminal. The prosecutor, a young guy named Marcus Wright, was ready for this. He pulled out the HOA approval form with Patricia's signature. Your Honor, Miss Kendrick approved the installation of this system 3 months before she removed it. The approval form specifically mentions the connection to the fire hydrant system. She knew exactly what it was. Dalton looked at the document, then at Patricia. I saw a brief flash of anger cross the lawyer's face. Patricia had apparently not mentioned this detail to her own attorney. Your Honor, I need a moment to consult with my client. The judge, a stern woman named Judge Catherine Palmer, nodded. 5 minutes. Dalton and Patricia had a heated, whispered conversation at the defense table. I couldn't hear what was said, but Patricia's face got redder and redder. When they returned to their positions, Dalton looked resigned. Your Honor, I'd like to request a continuance to review new evidence. Denied. Miss Dalton, did your client inform you that she had approved the installation of the equipment she later removed? No, Your Honor. Judge Palmer looked at Patricia with obvious disapproval. Miss Kendrick, you're making this worse for yourself. The evidence shows that you knowingly approved a connection to the fire hydrant system, then later removed it without authorization, causing damage to city property and compromising fire safety. I'm binding you over for trial on all charges. Patricia tried to speak, but the judge cut her off. Save it for trial. Bail is continued at the same terms. Next case. I left the courthouse feeling vindicated. Tom was waiting for me outside, grinning. That went even better than I hoped. Her lawyer is going to tell her to take a plea deal now. No way she wants to go to trial with evidence like that. Tom was right. 2 weeks later, Patricia accepted a plea agreement. She pled guilty to theft and criminal damage to city property. The tampering with fire safety equipment charge was dropped as part of the deal. She was sentenced to 6 months in jail, suspended pending 3 years of probation, a $5,000 fine, and she had to pay full restitution to the city for the repairs, which came to just over $15,000. She also had to do 200 hours of community service. But the civil case was where the real consequences hit. Tom filed a lawsuit against both Patricia personally and the HOA for theft, conversion of property, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and business interruption. My woodworking business had lost almost a week of work because of the hose theft, which meant lost income and missed deadlines. The HOA's insurance company settled immediately. They didn't want to go to court defending Patricia's actions, especially since she'd been removed as president and criminally convicted. They offered $50,000, which Tom said was a good deal. I accepted. Patricia's personal liability was another matter. She refused to settle, insisting through her lawyer that she shouldn't be held personally responsible for actions she took as HOA president. Tom took her to court. The civil trial was held in April, 4 months after the initial incident. Spring had finally come to Minnesota, melting the snow and ice that had been around during the whole mess. I testified again, going through the same story. Tom presented evidence of my business losses, the cost of the repairs, and the stress the whole situation had caused. Patricia took the stand in her own defense. She'd lost weight since January and looked haggard. Her lawyer tried to paint her as a dedicated volunteer who'd made an error in judgment. I spent 5 years making Meadowbrook Heights a better place to live, Patricia said. I enforced the rules fairly and consistently. If I made a mistake with Mr. Peterson's hose, it was an honest mistake, not malicious. Tom cross-examined her. Miss Kendrick, you approved Mr. Peterson's heated hose installation in October. Is that correct? I signed a lot of forms. I don't remember that specific one, but you did sign it. Tom held up the form. That appears to be my signature. And the form clearly states that the hose will be connected to the fire hydrant system. Do you see that? Patricia squinted at the document. Yes. So when you removed the hose in January, you knew it was connected to the fire hydrant system. I didn't remember that detail, but you had access to the HOA files. You could have checked before taking someone's property. I was enforcing a clear violation. External hoses aren't allowed during winter, except heated hoses that are meant to remain connected. Did you check the rules before removing the hose? Patricia didn't answer immediately. Tom waited. Miss Kendrick, did you check the rules? I know the rules. I wrote most of them. That's not what I asked. Did you check the specific rule about heated hoses before you removed Mr. Peterson's property? No. Tom nodded. No further questions. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. They found Patricia liable on all counts and awarded me $75,000 in damages. Combined with the HOA settlement, I'd received $125,000 total. But more than the money, what mattered was the message. You can't just take people's property because you're on a power trip. There are consequences for abusing authority. Patricia filed for bankruptcy 2 months later. Between the criminal restitution, the civil judgment, and her legal fees, she was financially ruined. Her husband, who I'd barely ever seen during the whole ordeal, divorced her. She put her house up for sale in June. The HOA under Stewart's leadership was completely different. They reviewed every fine and violation Patricia had issued and refunded over $30,000 to residents who'd been wrongly charged. They revised the bylaws to require board approval for any violation notice, prevent any single person from taking enforcement action alone, and establish an appeals process for residents who disagreed with violations. My heated hose remained connected and operational. The city sent an inspector every 3 months to check it, which was more frequent than required, but I didn't mind. After what happened, I wanted to make sure everything was documented and proper. I ran into Patricia once more before she moved away. It was late July, and I was leaving the hardware store downtown when I saw her loading boxes into a U-Haul truck. She looked older than she was, tired and defeated. Our eyes met for a moment, and I saw something I hadn't expected. Not anger or defiance, but genuine regret. She walked over to me slowly, like she wasn't sure if I'd talk to her or walk away. "Patrick," she said, "I know this doesn't mean anything, and I know you have no reason to believe me, but I'm sorry. I was wrong about everything." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to tell her off, to list all the ways she'd made people's lives miserable. But looking at her, broken and humiliated, I couldn't do it. "Why did you do it?" I asked. "Why did you take the hose?" She was quiet for a moment. "I don't know. I think I liked the power. I liked being the person who decided what was right and wrong. And when you installed that hose, even though I'd approved it, it bothered me. It was so visible, so obvious. I kept looking at it and thinking about how it broke the aesthetic I'd worked so hard to create. And I convinced myself that removing it was the right thing to do." "You destroyed your own life over a garden hose." "I know. I destroyed a lot more than that. I hurt a lot of people, made them afraid to enjoy their own homes, all because I thought I was maintaining standards." She laughed bitterly. "I was just being a bully." "Where are you going?" "Phoenix. My sister lives there. I'm going to start over, get a regular job, no HOA, no power trips, just a normal life." I nodded. "Good luck with that." "Thank you. And Patrick, I really am sorry, for what it's worth." She walked back to her truck and drove away. I never saw her again. Life in Meadowbrook Heights improved dramatically after Patricia left. The new HOA board focused on actual community maintenance rather than petty rule enforcement. They organized neighborhood parties, coordinated street repairs, and handled real issues like snow removal and landscaping. People were happier, friendlier, more willing to be part of the community. My woodworking business thrived. The publicity from the case, weird as it was, brought in new customers. People liked the idea of supporting the guy who'd stood up to an abusive HOA. I hired an assistant and expanded my workshop. The heated hose continued to work perfectly through the next winter and beyond. Every time I saw it, I thought about how one impulsive act by someone drunk on petty power had nearly caused a disaster. How Patricia had risked fire safety for an entire neighborhood because she didn't like how something looked. Stewart served as HOA president for 2 years before stepping down. A younger couple, the Rodriguezes, who'd been fined for their Christmas lights, took over as co-presidents. They were great, bringing fresh energy and common sense to the role. I stayed in Meadowbrook Heights. For a while, I'd considered moving, getting away from the whole mess. But this was my home. I'd built my business here, made friends here, and I wasn't going to let Patricia's actions drive me away. The story became neighborhood legend. New residents would hear about the HOA president who stole a heated hose and didn't know it connected to a fire hydrant. It became a cautionary tale about the dangers of giving someone too much power without oversight. Tom and I stayed friends. He'd loved the case, called it the most interesting one he'd handled in years. He showed up at my workshop occasionally to buy cutting boards or furniture, always joking that I should get myself into more legal trouble just to keep things interesting. The fire department used the incident in training sessions. Morrison, the firefighter who'd responded that first morning, told me later that they now specifically checked for authorized hydrant connections during inspections and had updated their procedures for dealing with tampering. The city revised their program for allowing connections to the fire hydrant system. They added requirements for more visible signage and regular inspections. They also added criminal penalties specifically for unauthorized disconnection, something that hadn't been clearly defined before. As for Patricia, I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she was doing okay in Phoenix. Working as an administrative assistant, living quietly, no longer involved with any HOAs. Part of me hoped she'd learned her lesson and found some peace. Another part of me thought justice had been served, regardless of what happened to her next. The whole experience taught me something important about power and accountability. HOAs serve a purpose, maintaining community standards and protecting property values. But when someone like Patricia takes that purpose and twists it into a weapon for controlling others, the whole system breaks down. You need checks and balances, oversight, and the willingness to stand up when someone crosses the line. That's why I stayed active with the HOA after everything settled down. I joined the board 2 years later, specifically to make sure we never had another Patricia situation. I helped write new bylaws that required financial audits, limited individual authority, and created real consequences for abuse of power. I also became something of a neighborhood advocate for people dealing with HOA issues. When someone received a violation notice they thought was unfair, they'd come to me for advice. I'd review the bylaws, help them understand their rights, and sometimes intervene with the board on their behalf. Not because I enjoyed conflict, but because I remembered what it felt like to wake up and find someone had stolen my property over a made-up rule. The hardware store downtown started carrying heated hoses after my case made the news. The owner, a friendly guy named Rick, put up a sign, "Heated hoses, HOA proof and fire department approved." He sold dozens of them that first winter. My workshop became a gathering place for neighborhood guys who wanted to learn woodworking. I started teaching informal classes on weekends, showing people how to use basic tools and build simple projects. It wasn't about the money, it was about community, about building something positive out of the negative experience with Patricia. Margaret Chen, the older woman who'd spoken up at the meeting, became a good friend. She'd lived in Meadowbrook Heights for 30 years and had watched Patricia's rise to power. She told me that Patricia had started out normal, genuinely wanting to help the community. But somewhere along the way, the authority had gone to her head. She'd started seeing violations everywhere, treating neighbors like subjects rather than equals. "Power corrupts," Margaret said over tea one afternoon in my kitchen. "Especially small power. Give someone authority over their neighbors and no oversight, and some people turn into tyrants." Patricia wasn't a bad person originally. She just forgot that she was supposed to serve the community, not rule it. I thought about that a lot. How many other neighborhoods had their own Patricia? Someone who'd taken a volunteer position and turned it into a dictatorship. How many people put up with abuse because they didn't want to make waves or didn't know they could push back? The local news did a follow-up story on HOA reform a year after my case concluded. They interviewed me, Stewart, and several other residents. The story sparked a city-wide conversation about HOA oversight and accountability. Rochester revised their municipal code to require HOAs to register with the city and submit annual reports. It wasn't much, but it was something. I framed the news article and hung it in my workshop, not out of pride, but as a reminder. A reminder that standing up to abuse matters, even when it seems like a small thing. A reminder that community is built on respect and cooperation, not control and intimidation. My heated hose still runs today, keeping water flowing to my workshop through the brutal Minnesota winters. It's more than just a tool now. It's a symbol of what happens when ordinary people refuse to be bullied. When they stand up and say no, this isn't right, and demand accountability. Every winter when I connect my hose and hear the water flowing, I think about that freezing January morning when I discovered it was gone. About the chain of events that followed, the people who stepped up to help, and the changes that came from refusing to accept theft disguised as authority. Patricia learned an expensive lesson about the limits of power. The neighborhood learned that they didn't have to tolerate abuse from their HOA. And I learned that sometimes the smallest act of standing up for yourself can trigger massive change. The Meadowbrook Heights HOA is now one of the best-run associations in Rochester. They maintain the neighborhood without harassing residents. They enforce legitimate rules without making up nonsense violations. And they remember what happened when one person thought she could take whatever she wanted without consequences. As for my business, it continued to grow. The publicity brought customers, but quality kept them coming back. I expanded my workshop again, hired 2 more assistants, and started taking custom orders from across Minnesota. None of that would have happened if I hadn't stood up to Patricia that January morning. Life moved on. Seasons changed. New neighbors moved in, old neighbors moved out. The community center got renovated. The streets got repaved. Normal life in a normal neighborhood, the way it should be. But everyone who was there during the heated hose incident remembered. They remembered the day the HOA president got arrested for stealing a hose connected to a fire hydrant. They remembered Patricia being led away in handcuffs, crying about how she was just enforcing the rules. They remembered the neighborhood coming together to take their community back from someone who'd forgotten she was supposed to serve, not command. And every time I walk past that fire hydrant on the corner of Maple and Oak, I smile. That hydrant, the source of so much chaos and change, still sits there painted red and yellow, A reminder that even the smallest thing can matter enormously when someone decides to abuse their power. The connection is still there, properly installed and regularly inspected. Water flows through my heated hose, keeping my business running, keeping my livelihood secure. And nobody, not Patricia or anyone else, can take that away because I followed the rules, got the proper approvals, and stood up when someone tried to steal what was rightfully mine. That's the real ending to this story. Not revenge or victory, but standing up for what was right and building something better from the mess. Meadowbrook Heights is a better place now, and my life is better too. All because I refused to let someone take my heated hose during a freeze, and she didn't know it connected to the fire hydrant system.